It was a damp and overcast morning when Marcus Washington, the newly appointed police chief of Fairview, stepped out of his car. The air felt thick, as if the humidity hung heavy with the weight of unspoken history. In a town like this, where everyone thought they knew everyone else, Marcus knew he had to approach this day differently. For 2 decades he had climbed the ladder of law enforcement with patience and dedication, yet today he was not wearing the uniform of a leader, but that of an ordinary man, one who would be overlooked, one who would blend in with the crowd. Dressed in a plain navy hoodie, worn jeans and sneakers, Marcus looked nothing like the person who had just been appointed to one of the most challenging roles in the department's history. His decision to forgo the usual ceremonial uniform was intentional. He needed to see things for what they truly were, unfiltered by the polished lens of handshakes and rehearsed greetings. He had heard the rumors, the whispers of corruption, the murmurs of racial tension, and the stories of officers who ignored their oaths. But the only way to confront these issues was to witness them firsthand, not in the context of formal meetings or behind closed doors, but in the midst of the daily grind. As he approached the precinct building, Marcus noticed the usual bustle, the faint chatter, the sound of shoes clicking against the tiled floor, the smell of stale coffee filling the air. Officers moved in and out, completely unaware of the presence of their new chief. He surveyed the parking lot, eyes scanning for signs of life, for the subtle behaviors that spoke louder than words. He didn't expect to be recognized, not yet anyway. His appointment had been made public just days ago, but he had chosen to arrive without fanfare, hoping to avoid the spectacle and simply observe. Despite the casual nature of the morning, Marcus could feel the weight of his mission pressing down on him. He was stepping into a firestorm. He was a black man in a town that had long been divided by race and within a department where power had been abused and trust had been eroded. But he knew this wasn't just about him. This was about a community that needed healing, about a department that needed accountability, and about a culture that needed to be dismantled from within. As he walked towards the building, Marcus's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of laughter coming from the break room, and he knew this would be his first test. He adjusted his baseball hat, taking a deep breath. This was only the beginning. Inside the precinct, the air was thick with the hume of typical office banter. Laughter, the clatter of keyboards, and the dull ring of phones. The environment was deceptively normal. It was the kind of atmosphere that could lull anyone into a false sense of comfort, the kind that would allow the most egregious behaviors to go unnoticed. Marcus could already sense it, even before he made his first move. The toxicity that lingered within these walls wasn't something that could be wiped away with a mere policy change or a few stern words. It was a cancer that had taken root deep in the hearts and minds of those who wore the badge. As he walked further into the building, he could see groups of officers huddled together near their desks, some laughing about something inconsequential, others arguing about trivial matters. The usual office chatter that masked the deeper issues, the casualness that spoke volumes about a culture long gone unchecked. He made his way toward the break room, stepping lightly, making sure to keep a low profile. No one seemed to take much notice of him. His presence was unnoticed, even if only for the moment, and that suited him just fine. The last thing he wanted was to be acknowledged as the new chief before he had seen how things truly worked in this precinct. It wasn't long before the tension in the room began to rise, and Marcus felt it. The subtle change in energy, the shift in focus. The moment came when Officer Davis, a tall man with a swagger that seemed out of place, noticed Marcus standing near the door. His voice cut through the noise of the room, sharp and condescending. "Hey, what are you doing here?" he sneered. The words felt like a slap, sharp and sudden, but Marcus remained silent, observing. His intuition told him this officer wasn't just questioning a stranger. He was asserting dominance, dismissing anyone who didn't conform to the image of the rightful occupant of these spaces. Before Marcus could say a word, Davis pushed forward, his face inches away. "We don't need your kind here," he sneered, his voice rising to catch the attention of the other officers who had now gathered around, watching with amusement. The words hit Marcus like a tidal wave, but he stayed composed. He had come here to see the truth, not to fight it just yet. But what happened next would define the course of this day. Without any provocation, Davis spat in Marcus's face, his smug grin evident, as if his action had been justified. The room erupted with laughter, mocking the newcomer, as if this was just another joke in the daily routine. But in that moment, Marcus's mind raced. His body felt the heat of the insult, but his response was deliberate and slow. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a handkerchief, wiping his face. His actions were measured, as though to show that while Davis's behavior may have been quick and thoughtless, his own response would be calm and collected. "Is this how you treat everyone who enters here?" Marcus finally spoke, his voice steady, carrying a weight of authority that didn't belong to the man who stood in front of them. Davis looked taken aback, his bravado slipping. The officers around him grew silent, realizing that the situation had escalated from a trivial moment to something far more significant. But Marcus simply turned and walked away, the silence of the room louder than any words. He knew he was walking into something far deeper than this singular interaction, but this was the beginning of what he needed to confront. The briefing room was filled with a strange, almost electric silence when Marcus entered. It was as though the very air had shifted, as if the officers inside knew that something significant was about to unfold. The chatter that once filled the space now died down to murmurs. Marcus's footsteps echoed against the cold, sterile floor as he made his way to the front of the room, his presence commanding the kind of attention that didn't need to be demanded. His calm was deliberate, but beneath it there was an unmistakable current of authority. Captain Thomas, a seasoned officer with a graying mustache and an air of practiced professionalism, stood at the front, waiting for the crowd to settle. The officers who had been laughing only moments ago now stood in quiet anticipation, eyes darting nervously between one another. There was a noticeable shift in their demeanor, a discomfort that came from being caught off guard, from realizing that the casual, unquestioned behavior they had grown accustomed to might no longer be tolerated. Thomas cleared his throat, his voice firm as he called the room to attention. "All right, everyone, settle down. We've got an important introduction today," he said, but even his words seemed to carry a weight now that Marcus was in the room. A few officers exchanged glances, still unaware of the true nature of the man standing among them. Some were puzzled, others still skeptical, but none could escape the quiet tension that hung in the air. And then Marcus stepped forward, holding a thick folder that bore the precinct's official seal, placing it slowly on the lectern before him. His eyes swept across the room, his gaze unwavering, and the officers fell silent. They could feel it now, the shift in power, the change in the atmosphere. They had no idea what was coming, but they knew it was something they would not forget. As Marcus began to speak, his voice calm but resolute, every word seemed to carry the weight of years of experience, of purpose, and of a deep sense of duty. "Good morning," he began, his tone steady and measured. "My name is Marcus Washington, and as of today, I am your new chief of police." The words fell like a stone in the stillness of the room. For a moment no one moved, no one breathed. The silence was deafening. The smug grin that had adorned Officer Davis's face earlier now faltered, draining away as realization hit him like a freight train. He was no longer the top dog in the room. He wasn't even in control of his own actions anymore. His face turned crimson as the weight of his earlier actions caught up with him. Marcus let the moment hang in the air, giving everyone in the room time to absorb the truth. There were no jokes now, no smirks or whispered comments, just the cold, hard reality of what was happening. He wasn't just another figurehead sent to replace an old chief. He was here to change things, to root out the corruption and disrespect that had taken hold in this department. "What I witnessed this morning," Marcus continued, his voice carrying a gravity that made even the most hardened officers shift uncomfortably in their seats, "was eye-opening. I came here to see the department for what it truly is, to understand the culture that has been allowed to fester. What I saw was unacceptable." A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Marcus raised his hand, silencing them before they could speak. "I want to make one thing clear. The culture of disrespect and prejudice that has taken hold here ends today. I will not tolerate it." His words landed like thunder, echoing in the hearts of the officers who had laughed moments ago, mocking a man they had not known. Respect is not optional. It is the foundation of what we do. Without it, we fail not just each other, but the community we serve. Marcus stood there, his gaze unwavering, as the room processed his words. Every officer in that room now understood that the rules had changed. This wasn't just a new chief. This was a leader who would hold them accountable. And it was clear from his eyes that the time for complacency had passed. The weight of Marcus's words hung in the air like a storm cloud, thick and unyielding. Silence gripped the briefing room, the officers now acutely aware that the new chief was not a man to be taken lightly. Their unease grew as Marcus's gaze swept across the room, pausing momentarily on Officer Davis, who stood frozen by the wall, his smug demeanor completely erased. Marcus didn't need to raise his voice. His presence alone was enough to communicate the gravity of the moment. Without breaking eye contact, Marcus continued, "Officer Davis, I want to make something crystal clear. What you did this morning wasn't just disrespectful to me. It was a violation of everything this department stands for. It was a violation of the badge you wear and the oath you took. But most importantly, it was a violation of the trust the community has placed in us." Davis shifted uncomfortably, beads of sweat forming on his brow as he realized just how far out of line he had gone. His previous bravado had evaporated, leaving only the stark reality of his actions. The other officers watched in tense silence, their eyes flicking nervously between Davis and Marcus. They knew this was no longer just about one officer's mistake. It was about a much larger issue, one that went to the very core of the precinct's culture. Marcus took a slow step forward, his voice unwavering. "When you spat in my face, you didn't just disrespect me. You disrespected every officer who has worked hard to earn their place here. You disrespected the very essence of law enforcement, which is founded on respect, integrity, and service. You made it clear that you saw me as less than a person, someone who didn't belong." His eyes locked onto Davis's, and the officer flinched under the intensity of Marcus's stare. "For that, there will be consequences." Marcus's words were simple, yet they carried the weight of a promise that no one in the room could ignore. "Effective immediately, Officer Davis, you are suspended pending an internal investigation. You may think this is a slap on the wrist, but let me assure you, this is just the beginning." The room was electric with tension. Some officers exchanged glances. A few audibly shifted in their seats. This wasn't the kind of leadership they were used to. This wasn't the kind of response they expected when they pushed boundaries. But Marcus was not interested in maintaining the status quo. He was interested in setting a new standard, a standard that held everyone, no matter their rank or tenure, accountable for their actions. Marcus paused, letting the silence sink in before he spoke again. "This isn't about punishment. This is about accountability. I'm not here to play favorites. I'm here to ensure that every person in this room understands the gravity of their actions. Respect is not a privilege. It is a responsibility. And if you're not willing to rise to that responsibility, then this is not the place for you." The officers sat in stunned silence, the tension in the room palpable. For some, the realization was dawning. The change that Marcus spoke of was not just an abstract idea. It was here. And it wasn't going to be easy. As Marcus looked around the room, his voice softened, but there was no mistaking the firmness behind his words. "I understand change is hard. It's uncomfortable, but it's necessary, and we will get through this together. But know this: the culture of complacency, of accepting bad behavior as the norm, is over." With that, he turned and walked to the door, leaving the officers in a sea of contemplation. The next step had been taken. There was no turning back now. In the days that followed, a quiet but undeniable transformation began to take place within the precinct. It was not the kind of change that would be visible overnight, but those who had been paying attention could sense it in the air. Marcus's leadership had stirred something deep within the officers. It wasn't just the suspension of Officer Davis. It was the sudden, sharp clarity that had emerged from the tension of the briefing room. For the first time in years, there was a reckoning, an acknowledgement that things could no longer be swept under the rug. Marcus made a point to walk the halls regularly, moving through the precinct with a quiet authority that left a lasting impression. He greeted every officer he passed, no matter their rank or position. It was small, seemingly insignificant gestures like these that began to erode the walls of division. The officers who had once laughed at Davis's antics now avoided him, casting furtive glances his way as he sat alone at his desk, his smugness replaced with a bitter sense of isolation. But not all were ready to change. Some continued to resist, clinging to the old ways with a stubbornness that only made them more apparent. Officer Hernandez, a veteran with decades on the force, was one such officer. He had been one of the quiet supporters of Davis's behavior, content to look the other way when his colleagues crossed the line. When Marcus passed by him one morning, Hernandez gave a curt nod, but made no effort to engage, his face hard with suspicion. But even Hernandez couldn't escape the growing pressure to adapt. Over the next few weeks, as the stories of Davis's suspension and the changes Marcus had promised spread, whispers of doubt began to surface. The old complacency was still there, but now it had an edge of fear. Fear that the unspoken rules, the silent agreements that allowed poor behavior to continue unchecked, were no longer acceptable. It wasn't just the officers who were feeling the change. Marcus knew that the community had been watching too. There were murmurs on the streets of Fairview, quiet conversations in coffee shops and at church services. People were cautiously optimistic, though many remained skeptical. The damage done by years of mistrust between the police and the community couldn't be healed overnight, but Marcus was determined to show them that he wasn't just talk. He had come to restore integrity, not just within his department, but within the very fabric of the relationship between law enforcement and the people they served. One afternoon, as he made his rounds, Marcus was approached by Officer Green, a younger recruit who had recently transferred from another precinct. Green was hesitant at first, but after a long pause, she spoke up. "Chief," she said, her voice low but sincere, "I want to do better. I've been complicit in the culture here. I didn't speak up when I should have. I didn't challenge the things that I knew were wrong, but I want to change. I want to be part of the solution." Marcus looked at her, his expression softening. "That's all I ask," he replied. "It starts with you. It starts with each of us." He placed a hand on her shoulder. "It won't be easy, but if you're committed to change, I'll be right beside you." Green nodded, a small but determined smile breaking across her face. It was a small victory, but it was one that filled Marcus with a quiet hope. Change would take time, much longer than he had hoped, but the seeds of it were being planted. Every conversation, every moment of self-reflection was a step toward the department he had always envisioned. The road ahead would be long, and not everyone would be willing to walk it, but Marcus knew that this was just the beginning. He had no illusions that the precinct would be transformed overnight, but with each passing day he could see the cracks in the old culture. Slowly they were as the weeks turned into months. Marcus continued to lead with the unwavering conviction that he had come to Fairview for a purpose far greater than just enforcing the law. He had come to rebuild trust between his officers, within the community, and with himself. The road was still long, but small victories were emerging every day. Officers who had once felt untouchable were now questioning their actions, recognizing the consequences of their past complacency. New recruits, like Officer Green, were finding the courage to speak up, to hold themselves and their colleagues accountable. The department was slowly shifting, not just in policy, but in heart. One day, while attending a community outreach event, Marcus met a young boy, no older than 10, who approached him with wide eyes and a hesitant smile. "Are you really the chief?" the boy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus crouched down to meet his gaze, smiling warmly. "Yes, I am," he replied. The boy looked down, his voice soft as he spoke again. "My dad says the police don't care about us." Marcus's heart tightened, but he kept his composure. "I can't change the past, but I promise you, we're working hard to do better. And if you ever need help, you come find me, okay?" The boy nodded, a small but genuine smile breaking across his face. It was moments like this that reminded Marcus why he had taken the job in the first place. Not for the power, not for the recognition, but for the chance to change lives. To show a generation that their voices mattered, that the badge they saw on his chest represented something more than authority. It represented hope. But Marcus knew this was just the beginning. He had faced resistance and would continue to face it. The department wasn't perfect yet, and the journey ahead was far from smooth. But each day was a step toward something better, and each officer who made a conscious choice to change was a victory in itself. For those who are committed to the journey of change, whether in your community or your workplace, remember, true transformation doesn't come without its struggles. But it's worth it. If you believe in the power of change, in the importance of holding ourselves accountable, and in making a difference where it counts, then let's keep pushing forward together. If you've found inspiration in Marcus's journey, or if you believe that transformation is possible no matter how entrenched the problem may seem, I encourage you to subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment below and share your thoughts. Whether it's your own story of change, a moment of realization, or how you're actively working toward making a positive difference in your community, your voice matters, and we're in this together. Let's continue this conversation. Subscribe now and join a community of people who are committed to making a real impact. Because change doesn't happen in isolation, it happens when we come together and refuse to accept the status quo.